Welcome back to the Iceberg of Economics. We are now on part 5 of 9. We're going to start getting into some more crazy heterodox stuff here. Some of the stuff we actually covered a lot in part 4, so if I'm short on some of these, that's why. The first one is the Donahue Levitt hypothesis, which I did talk about when I discussed Freakonomics. It's really the idea of that legalizing abortion lowered crime rates due to those who were born into dire circumstances such as abject poverty were never born, and so they never grew up to be teenagers who would later commit crimes. And so, what the Donahue Levitt hypothesis really goes into is they saw how, starting about 15 to 16 years after Roe v. Wade was made law of the land, you started to see a dramatic plunge in crime. And it's usually mid-teens or when peak age for petty criminal behavior, between basically 16 to 24 years old, statistically, for young men to commit crimes. So they conclude that just less of these future potential criminals being born, therefore, lowers the crime rate. This is controversial in a lot of ways. Pro-life people do not like it because it is a justification saying that cracking the eggs are worth making the omelet, in terms of even if these people could have become the next great inventors or thinkers or philosophers or businessmen or women. Was it fair to take away their life because our society has less crime? And whereas those on the left criticize it because it just caters to stereotypes that those from disadvantaged backgrounds who are more likely to have abortions also happen to be likely to be criminal behaviors, and they think it fails to tackle other potential systematic causes of crime that are not as obvious. I already talked about that. So let's move on to the next one, which is Praxeology, which is my main beef with Austrian economics. Praxeology is really the idea that theory and human action is that people do purposeful behavior, not just random behavior or reactionary reflexive behavior based on their circumstances. And how this applies to economics is that because every person alive has a different purpose and different goals, you cannot quantify people in the aggregate. And since you cannot quantify people in the aggregate, you cannot use econometrics or any sort of quantitative models to make predictions or observations about the economy. Every economic theory has to be just judged on its a priori or rhetorical merits. And this is really just inherently a rejection of empiricism and the scientific method. And it's also just, if you want to actually try to solve issues in the economy, wouldn't it be good if you can actually statistically back what you're trying to say? I think this is just a cop-out saying, since people are individuals inherently, we can't make any conclusions about what collect people do on the aggregate, because we just rather just philosophize and not have to actually back up our theories. And this is somebody who has a pro-market Austrian policy perspective on a lot of things, but I mean, I think especially in the age of big data, where you can run back and test your hypotheses in real world circumstances, not just in a college classroom, I think it's a very intellectually dishonest approach. The next one, and those who are pro-praxeology, feel free to make your arguments in the comments. I have read Human Action, so I would happily make this a dialogue. The next thing I would like to discuss on this tier is anarchist economics. Surprisingly, anarchy isn't really just as simple as I don't want a government. there are multiple ways you can have an anarchist society. The two most notable ones, which I'm going to talk about, are anarcho-capitalists, or the ANCAP movement, or anarcho-collectivists, which is more traditional anarchism, where you think of the radical borderline terrorist movements in the turn of the 20th century. Like, I think it was an anarchist who shot President McKinley. But with anarcho-capitalism is the idea that you have no government, but you still have a free market, and the free market and private businesses replace all the services that the state would. Some services probably could be done better in the private sector than the government has. But the main flaw with anarcho-capitalism is that there are a few core services that if you had them essentially outsourced to either insurance companies or private security companies, those companies will either conduct M&A with each other or compete with each other, or maybe even with violence to gain a monopoly. And if you have a monopoly on violence or guaranteeing security, that effectively makes you a state. And then also the other flaw with anarcho-capitalism is that it has to be global, because even if one country just maintains a state and everybody else is anarcho-capitalist, eventually the organization of the state, or those places in the world that still operate under a state system, will just conquer the ANCAP countries, or the ANCAP countries will effectively have to make a government and a military to fight off invaders. And that's not even going to other issues. I think the main way to really kind of defeat the argument for anarcho-capitalism is the idea of privatizing security. And then with courts, there's also a difficulty of that, is that who is going to enforce a ruling? I guess your reputation, like a credit score, can, but if the cost of complying for the loser is big enough, and there's no legal means to enforce that claim, then big losers of lawsuits are just not going to comply. And the criminal penal system is the same thing. And then you could also have it in a way that it's not really a free and fair legal system too. Like, it's very easy to probably manipulate that with whichever the plaintiff or the defendant has more funds will have an advantage of choosing the arbiter. I guess you could use Yelp reviews. I'm not going to get into ANCAP arguments, but the fundamental flaw is that inevitably whoever is in charge of defense is going to consolidate and become a state. And instead of having the federal government be in charge, you have an insurance company. Actually are examples of, maybe not insurance company, but company rule in other places, such as what happened with the Dutch and British East India companies in India and Indonesia. But yeah, that's anarcho-capitalism. It's the idea that there is no government, but there still is a fully functioning free market economy that everybody voluntarily participates in. And I think it sounds great in theory, don't get me wrong, but I think anarcho-capitalism is the communist of the right. Like, the difference is that really anarcho-capitalism really hasn't been tried on a major country like for long enough a period of time to see how it actually works. But given just the theoretical flaws of it, that's probably a good thing it hasn't been tried on a mass scale. But yeah, the next one is anarcho-collectivism, which is traditional anarchism, which is not just the abolition of government like the ANCAPs want. They also want the abolition of private property. So it's really just kind of complete chaos. There is no ownership. Nobody owns anything. People, if they want to get things done in an anarchist system, everybody has to work together and equally share or figure out a fair way of doing it without nobody having sort of unfair or predetermined claim on any property. Because in an anarchist system, who's going to enforce property rights? In an anarcho-capitalist system, in theory, you have arbitration run by private companies and a private court system and private insurance companies or private security companies maintain property rights. But in a pure anarchist system, there wouldn't really be any of those things because there wouldn't be private industry. So there is no property, because there is nobody enforcing property rights. There are no property rights. I mean, it sounds to me like a giant tragedy of the commons is how that would turn out. And there have been attempts to try to do anarchist societies, but none of them have really ever worked. I don't really know where I would put. I mean, I think, and also like pure communism, like in the most idealized form, would be considered this type of anarchist ideology. The main critiques that anarchists have of Marxism and communism is the whole transition stage where it requires an authoritarian state to control all the means of productions, and that they would never really be able to drop that. And that is exactly, anarchists were correct about that. If you've seen what happened in the history of the Soviet Union and China and other places that did get to that intermediate stage but never really, quote unquote, crossed the finish line. Now, after anarchist economics, the next one we're going to be speaking of Marx is the transformation problem. The transformation problem is the contradiction between Karl Marx's labor theory of value, which is basically the idea that the value of something is based on how much labor it costs to produce it from its raw material state, or if it's a raw material, the amount of labor it costs to extract the raw material, versus the idea that profit rates tend to equalize among industries, and that capital-intensive industries tend to have higher profit margins than labor-heavy industries, even if you adjust and take wages out of the calculations. Like, that's the problem, is that, and also companies with smaller labor forces per dollar, or more money per worker, if you inverse it, tend to also be more profitable. Like, when a company that if the labor is the driver of value, a company that spends the most on labor should, in theory, be the most profitable company. But that's not really how it works in the real world. Like, big tech companies are a good example of this, actually. They have some of the lowest amounts of labor per $1 billion of revenue generated. And based on Marx's theory of value, that really shouldn't happen. That's the transformation problem. And really, Marx really tries to factor the account really for this in a variety of theoretical ways, saying that a lot of production has failed to transform the inputs. Also, the fact that the market prices change, too. Like, if something all of a sudden becomes outdated, like, for example, building a fax machine. So, if the cost of making a fax machine is still $50 of labor time, but now fax machines are worthless because nobody needs a fax machine anymore, does that mean that that labor was worth nothing, or is the fax machine still worth $50? You can see where there's a problem here, and the resolve the contradiction is really just is that every industry still receives the same profit in a way that's consistent of labor of value, but the price of production is basically a sum of mathematical formulas based to try to factor this in. But the bottom line is it shows the main flaw in the labor theory of value. The next thing we're going to be talking about is supply side economics, which is kind of like I've been criticizing a lot of people on the left for trying to shoehorn in their environmental or income inequality concerns into economics by creating an ideology that's saying that addressing those concerns are actually the best way to manage an economy, and we can prove it with X, Y, and Z formula. Well, supply side economics is kind of like the right wing version of I have an ideological goal and I need to build an economic and mathematical framework to justify it. And it's the idea that, like, instead of Keynesians, whose goal is to fix the economy by manipulating demand one way or the other, is that instead, if you want to have consistent economic growth, you make it so that the cost of increasing supply is low, and so therefore businesses will produce more supply. And so because in supply, there's more supply produced, prices fall, and therefore inflation drops, and therefore consumers have more disposable income, and that extra disposable income can be spent in other parts of the economy and therefore drive economic growth by just producing more and more stuff at lower and lower costs. There, this sounds terrific, and it has worked in a variety of industries. I think the problem really with this is that the mechanism isn't really perfectly translated. Like, the way apparently to create these all these bottlenecks is deregulation, which I do agree that part of it generally does work if you get rid of a lot of regulations that mainly just slow production without really doing much to resolve the externalities that those regulations were written to address. But the other key of it is just lowering taxes. So I say if you lower taxes effectively, that lowers the amount of money you need to make to have the same after-tax profits. And if lower taxes, you don't need as much pre-tax profit margin to get the same after-tax profit margin. So as a result, companies will have more capital to produce more supply and can sell at lower prices because you have even less money is going into taxes. But there's what's to say that, and this is the issue with trickle-down economics really fundamentally, is that what's to say that the companies will actually do that with the lower taxes instead of just keeping the prices where they're at, and pocketing the difference, or using that extra amount of profits to, instead of to increase supply, to decrease supply through buying competitors and then using their higher concentration in the market to cut supply and have a more monopolistic environment. So yeah, it's kind of in theory. And also the other problem is really not necessarily, if this was just cutting taxes is fine if the government cuts enough spending to keep the budget balanced. But my main issue with supply side economics is not the idea of lowering taxes. It's actually, all things equal, probably a net better world for the economy and for individual freedom. The problem is you can't cut taxes without cutting spending. It's kind of like Keynesianism in reverse, where the Keynesian solution is to increase government spending, but they fail to increase taxes or cut spending on the upcycle, even though they do all the stimulus on the down cycle. Supply side is the reverse. Okay, you cut taxes when the economy is down to stimulate it, but then when the economy is doing good, you don't cut the government spending to rebalance the budget, or in fact actually to generate surplus to pay back the deficits generated from the bad times. And that was really the fundamental problem, is that Reagan was unable to get Congress to pass spending cuts. And in fact, Reagan wanted to increase defense spending at this time while cutting taxes, and therefore he widened the deficits. And that has led to our current debt problems, and as an extension that will eventually be paid, and those taxes will go up, but instead of seeing a higher income tax rate on your tax return, those taxes will be paid through higher inflation. So it's really just, instead of being honest about it, that's really the end outcome of deficit spending is higher inflation. And that's my critique of supply side economics. Uh, the last two we have here are donut economics and super capitalism. Donut economics is another environmental economics theory where there's kind of an opportune zone which is kind of shaped like a donut, which is the balance between economic growth and environmental regulation to keep that growth sustainable. If you have too much environmental regulation and you fill up the hole in the donut, then you get an economy that is stagnant and causes a lot of social problems that are far worse than the marginally cleaner environment as a result of tightening these environmental regulations. Whereas the other side, let's just say if the donut is environmental regulations are too loose and you prioritize economic growth and target that, then the damage of the environment through pollution or climate change or other adverse negative externalities of modern industry and economic development, the damage from that, especially in the long term, if you calculate the future value of it, will be much more harmful than the marginal amount of economic growth you get from deregulating environmental policy. And this donut is the ring in the middle between being too restrictive on environmental policies and being too loose on environmental policies, and therefore destroying your environment just for not enough growth to justify it. And then the last one is super capitalism. Super capitalism is a term introduced by Benito Mussolini, a speech he gave in November 1933, where he discusses the stages of capitalism, where you had early stage capitalism called heroic capitalism, where it was the building and foundation of modern industry. And then static capitalism was when those industries became mature and the gains translated into mass society, but at the same time is kind of unevenly distributed. And then you had the final form, which is decadent capitalism, which is the idea is that it's this capitalist economy that is just really designed to sell to people's worst instincts and push mass consumption at the expense of actually like promoting human flourishment. It's really super capitalism is just like the macho fascistic way of saying late stage capitalism, which is this idea that you hear a lot about on memes on the internet where like capitalism isn't really working anymore, and so they just do these more desperate things to cater to the lowest and lowest denominators to keep people spending for things they never wanted, to impress people they don't like. Like a good like movie that kind of summarizes the ethos of the late stage capitalism anxiety was 1998's Fight Club. What happened with Edward Norton's character and his obsession with furniture until he joined Fight Club and kind of let go of all of it. I'm not going to spoil too much of it, but Fight Club and the ethos of Fight Club is the same kind of critique of late stage capitalism that Benito Mussolini had for super capitalism in a way. He wanted a more corporatist economy, which is really one of the roots of fascism, where the state and the government, even though the government doesn't own the companies, but the private industry will work with the state to help accomplish the state's goals in a one collective body or a corpus, which is where the word corporatism comes from. That concludes this layer. Now we've kind of gone through the first 5 of these, and layer 6 is going to get even more crazy. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.